I grew up in Kuna, Idaho, where the desert was practically my backyard. Growing up, I never really thought about the desert. It was just a big empty place back there. My dad and I would drive out there to look at the stars sometimes, but other than that, it was just a nowhere sort of place. Just a place for stars. Even as an adult, the desert rarely crossed my mind, unless I had to drive through it. It was never a destination. It was always a place you had to pass through to get to the place you're actually going. Even the pioneers felt that way on their way to Oregon. It wasn't until I became a student of biology that I learned about the magic of that big empty place. Turns out, biologists have been studying it for decades. There is a mountain of research about this place, yet I never learned about it growing up. It felt like they had kept this big secret from me, and from everyone else I knew. How could I grow up in a place for 20 years and yet know nothing about it? So it's about time that big secret was revealed, because our desert is unique and beautiful, and it's in trouble. The place I've always just called the desert is a type of semi-arid habitat called Sagebrush Steppe. The word steppe means grassland, so it's basically a shrubby grassland where the most common shrub types are, as you can probably guess, sagebrush. And this habitat covers a huge portion of the western United States, about 62 million acres. It spans 11 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Unlike arid desert climates like the Sahara Desert in Africa, a semi-arid desert isn't dry all the time. There is just enough water to support perennial shrubs and bunch grasses, but not quite enough water to support trees. Sagebrush steppe gets almost all of its moisture during the winter in the form of snowpack. As the snow melts, it supplies water to the plants and animals throughout the spring and into the summer. The native plants of the sagebrush steppe are well adapted to this water cycle. They have huge taproots that go deep into the soil to capture moisture, and most of their growth and germination happens in the spring before the whole place dries up. These populations of shrubs and bunch grasses support a plethora of animal species. Notably, the 2 poster children of the sagebrush steppe are the pygmy rabbit and the greater sage grouse.
So pygmy rabbits and sage grouse both are pretty unique in that they're really tightly coupled to the sagebrush ecosystem. They only live in sagebrush. For part of the year, almost their entire diet is sagebrush.
These species are called sagebrush obligates.
So it means that they cannot occur without sagebrush, and so they are completely dependent on sagebrush. If there's no sagebrush, that species is not going to be there.
It's not just obligate species that need the sagebrush. Hundreds of species rely on it directly and indirectly, from insects to birds to large mammals. That big place I always thought was empty, turns out it's not empty at all. But the pygmy rabbit and the sage grouse are especially sensitive to changes to the sagebrush steppe because they are so dependent on it.
They really do well and are most common in very undisturbed versions of a sagebrush ecosystem. When a sagebrush system starts to get degraded, they're one of the first species that starts to disappear. So they're considered a bellwether of that ecosystem.
They're kind of the canary in the coal mine for the sagebrush ecosystem.
Unfortunately, the sagebrush steppe that the pioneers saw when they headed west looked very different than much of the steppe today. Only about half of this ecosystem remains intact, which is pretty bad news for species like the pygmy rabbit and the sage grouse. But what happened to this habitat? Before European settlement, natural grazers west of the Rocky Mountains included ungulates like deer, pronghorn, and elk. As European settlement spread across North America in the 16th and 17th centuries, they brought their animals with them. Cattle, horses, sheep, and goats were introduced from Mexico to the southwest in the early 1700s. Back then, there was zero management of rangelands. Settlers crammed as many animals onto their lands as they possibly could. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the signing of the Homestead Act of 1862, and the expansion of the railroad led to an even greater push into the West. Cattle quickly grew as one of the most economically important uses of rangelands, and by the 1890s, There was an estimated 26 million cattle and 20 million sheep grazing the arid lands of the West unregulated. In the 1920s, concern about overgrazing was mounting. The Taylor Grazing Act was passed in 1934 to try to protect the remaining unclaimed land by setting up grazing districts and regulations. The Bureau of Land Management was established in 1946 to manage those grazelands. But it was already too late for the sagebrush. Decades of mismanagement had transformed millions of acres of unbroken sagebrush and bunch grasses into a sea of exotic weeds and annual grasses. The most notorious of these weeds is cheatgrass. You may know this grass. Its seeds often get stuck in your socks and shoes when you go on a hike. Cheatgrass was probably brought to the West in contaminated grain seed and was established there by the early 1890s. This grass has a completely different life cycle than the native plants of the steppe. Unlike perennial shrubs and grasses with their long taproots, cheatgrass is an annual plant with short, fibrous roots. This means that it is the first one to get all that spring runoff from the snowpack. It hogs all the water and other nutrients in the soil before new bunch grasses and shrubs can even get started. Not only that, this invasion of annual grasses has changed the natural cycles of the sage steppe ecosystem.
The annual grasses also change the fire regime and make the fires more frequent, more likely to start, and larger in extent when they do start, and they spread faster and they burn hotter.
In healthy sage steppe habitat, the brushes and bunch grasses grow in clumps. This helps reduce the spread of fire because the fuel sources are patchy and spread out. The annual grasses grow in between these clumps, forming a continuous carpet for the fire to travel on. They also germinate, grow, go to seed, and are dead by early spring, leaving lots of dry material around just in time for the hot, dry summers. With all that tinder, when lightning strikes, a large fire is inevitable. Large, stand-replacing fires used to be uncommon in the sagebrush habitat. They might only occur every 30, 50, or 100 years, but in areas that have been invaded by exotic annual plants, large fires can happen as frequently as every 5 years. Sagebrush and bunch grasses just aren't adapted to such a short fire cycle. It takes them decades to recover from fire, but the annual grasses can return within only one season. So once the shrub steppe is disturbed and exotic weeds move in, it's very difficult or impossible for the native plants to come back, even if the native plants do grow back. If cheatgrass or other exotic grasses are present, it's only a matter of time before fire will wipe them out again and the process starts all over. It's a vicious cycle.
And right now, fires are removing large areas of sagebrush. So there's a concern for species that live in the sagebrush, and especially sage grouse and pygmy rabbits, which live only in sagebrush habitats.
These changes are just one of the many threats against the sagebrush steppe.
Others include just human development. Our footprint just keeps increasing. It hasn't decreased. We have oil and gas development, which is common within sagebrush ecosystems. We have a lot of sagebrush that has been converted to tilled agriculture, and human development, subdevelopments, power lines, all these things have adverse effects.
Because this habitat has little economic or aesthetic value to many folks, it is often urbanized. Agriculture, housing, and energy development are far more profitable than a bunch of grouse and rabbits, despite their iconic status. Wind and solar development in sagebrush steppe will only increase as we shift away from fossil fuels, and this development is very disruptive to sensitive species like the sage grouse.
They're one of the most sensitive birds that they just don't tolerate disturbance as well as almost any other bird. They disappear pretty quickly when there's a fair amount of human development.
But the primary economic use of sage steppe habitat is still as rangeland.
Domestic livestock grazing occurs almost ubiquitously with where sage grouse occur. There's hardly any places where sage grouse live that don't have domestic livestock grazing.
Ranching is a vital industry for the economics of the western United States. Much of the sagebrush steppe is remote and rugged, making it difficult to adapt for other economic purposes. Sometimes grazing is the only viable use for these lands, but the impacts of grazing on sage grouse and other species living in the sagebrush steppe are not totally understood.
The relationship between sage grouse and domestic livestock grazing is clearly multifactorial. It's not simple. There are many facets of livestock grazing that are thought to have adverse effects on sage grouse, but there are other facets of livestock grazing that are thought to be a positive influence on sage grouse. And we really have very little data on any of those facets. That's a question that doesn't have a very clear answer, and that's why we are focusing a large research project on that very topic.
The sagebrush ecosystem, even though it covers a very broad area of the western United States, has really been altered and changed in very many ways and continues to change.
So what can we do to help this unique and troubled landscape? Well, researchers are already doing a lot. Some of that research is to help us better understand what makes good quality habitat for the species that live there.
We're interested in habitat, and we're interested in understanding how animals perceive the habitat. When you and I look across the sagebrush, it looks pretty much the same. And to the animals, it's absolutely not. I mean, there is a lot of subtlety as far as quality of habitat.
One way to understand what makes habitat good or bad is by studying how animals literally see the habitat. This is called viewshed ecology.
Viewshed ecology, it's the study of what animals can see in their environment and how that visual information influences their behavior and also their interactions with the environment.
Most animals use visual information to make decisions, but how they use that information is different depending on the animal. Sage grouse, for example, perform mating displays that they want other sage grouse to see, but that also means that predators can see them, so they want habitat where they can be in the open but also see the predators coming. Pygmy rabbits, on the other hand, use camouflage to hide from predators, so they want habitat where they can hide but still see predators coming.
So viewshed is really important whether you have a very large viewshed or a small viewshed. And what's challenging is figuring out how to measure that from the animal's perspective, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Dr. Racklow and her team are using LiDAR to model pygmy rabbit burrowing locations to try to understand what it is about those locations that the rabbits find appealing. They want to see what the rabbits see when they look through a clump of sagebrush. LiDAR uses lasers that bounce off of objects back to a sensor. The time it takes for the laser to hit the object and return to the sensor corresponds with how far away that object is. This creates lots of data points, tens of millions of data points, that they put into programs that create three-dimensional clouds of data. These 3D models help them figure out the nuances of the habitat that the rabbits like.
A lot of sagebrush is changing. It's changing because of fire, because of invasive plants, because of land use change. And there are a lot of efforts to restore sagebrush, especially after the big fires we've had. And if we want to have a target for restoring sagebrush that's healthy for the animals that live there, we need to know how do they use the habitat? What is good habitat? And to measure that effectively, we want to do it from the animal's perspective.
But all that science won't do the sagebrush steppe any good if we don't use that information in management.
We can't make good decisions without good science, and good science isn't something you can do in a year or two. You need dedicated people collecting a lot of data in a transparent and objective way. And that's the way to make informed decisions such that hopefully all stakeholders can get behind good science and say, yeah, that is good science. That's not something that our experts can poke a hole in because it was done incredibly well. That's obviously the role of the university and agency scientists to ensure that we do work on these topics that are affecting legal decisions and policy decisions now and in the future, instead of trying to shy away from that because it's too politically charged. We need to be doing more science and more rigorous science to address those issues.
Voting for representatives who support the scientific management and conservation of public lands is one powerful way that the average citizen can help the sagebrush. By supporting science, we can support ecosystems we care about. Before I learned about the sagebrush steppe, I couldn't have even told you what a sagebrush looked like. But when I got out there, in the sagebrush, and really experienced it, my perspective of the desert was forever changed. It's an ecosystem that deserves to be known. that deserves to be cared about. It is the symbol of the West. It's our heritage. With everyone I've ever talked to who has spent any time at all in the Sagebrush Steppe, the sentiment is the same. You can't understand or appreciate the Sagebrush Steppe by driving past it on the highway.
A lot of people see it as a wasteland or not an attractive environment, but if you get out into the middle of a pristine sagebrush ecosystem, it's truly beautiful. It's diverse. Plant diversity is incredibly high with beautiful wildflowers. The smell of wild sage is magical. It's wonderful, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
It's beautiful in a different way. It's beautiful in a not obvious way. And so the sagebrush system to me is a system that has all these little secrets that aren't obvious, that you have to look for them. And the beauty is the same. And so for me, it's an important ecosystem for the West. It's important for people. It's important for wildlife. And it's one that's a little bit secretive.